This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, the chairman of NYSE Governance Services, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this very special show today. As you can see, this is not our normal setting. We're sitting here on the stage at the National Investor Relations Institute's annual convention here in Las Vegas, and we get this wonderful setting. And of course, since we're here at NIRI, we're going to be talking about investor relations and the board. And joining me to have that conversation is John Dawson, who's the Director of Investor Relations for National Grid. Welcome, John.
Thank you, TK.
Quite a setting, isn't it?
It's a fantastic setting.
Yes. So maybe the first thing that would be good to do is for you to just explain to the audience what National Grid is, okay? And also, I know that you're listed both in the US and overseas. Just explain that a little bit too.
Certainly, TK. So National Grid is one of the world's largest privately owned utilities. We have about a third of our business here in the US, which makes us the fifth largest utility in the domestic US market. Internationally, we're a 55 billion sterling, about $80 billion business.
That is the size that would catch somebody's attention, that's for sure. So, John, we invited you because you're a rare beast, okay? You've actually been a career IR professional in 5 different industries over your 17-year career.
That's right.
Since our directors are our most common viewer of this, talk about what has been the key for you in building the right relationship with the boards to make sure you're having the biggest impact.
TK, you're hitting on absolutely the most important role that IR plays today for me, which is about building the bridge between the shareholders who own the company and the board of directors, particularly the executive, but also the non-executive members of the board who make decisions on their behalf. And building that relationship and making it work effectively, you have to be a conduit, a two-way flow of information, not only the key role we play presenting the company outside the business, but also bringing information in, making it digestible and understandable in the context of the strategy, and helping the executive team, but also the non-executive team of the board to make the right decisions at the critical time. So being open, being flexible, listening to their needs, and then working hard to gather the input they need to make those decisions is absolutely key to that process. And
John, have you found out in recent years that your interaction with the board has increased? It has, certainly. I mean, governance, both here in the US, but also in the UK, has been a growing agenda for boards. Investors want their voice heard more consistently. They want the board to react and to understand what they're saying. And therefore, having that presence, that role in the boardroom on a regular basis, discussing the key issues that they have, presenting them, making them, as I say, digestible and understandable, it's happening more and more. And for experienced IROs, it's a common theme. Well, throughout your career, you've found yourself in some fairly colorful positions. And particularly one that I remember was the Cadbury Kraft takeover in 2010. So that's an interesting one for us to focus on. Talk a little bit about the IR's role in a situation like that, and then your relationship at that time with the directors. This was, for me, one of the most challenging but also enjoyable times in my career. You're in the real heat of a battle, so to speak. This was one of those rare deals that went truly hostile. So we ended up having a very public defense, which put a lot of pressure on the team internally. Because of that heat and the intensity of discussions for the executive and the non-executive directors, every decision they made, everything they had to consider was reviewed not only within the boardroom, but across the front pages of the newspapers as well.
So that the pressure on understanding what was happening with investors, what was happening with the commentary from the analysts and the other stakeholders around the company was absolutely key. And having regular updates with the chairman, with the senior independent directors and the exec team were absolutely essential to make sure that that information was right. So being part of the central hub, if you like, that sort of core activity that's involved in the defense was essential. But it started long before that in many ways. One of the good things we'd done at Cadbury was to build barriers before Kraft came along. So we actually had a lot of goodwill from our stakeholders, from the shareholders in the company. As a result, when Kraft approached with their initial offer, they didn't get what they wanted, which was destabilization of the register. Hedge funds didn't buy in to a great extent until very late on in the process. And that was only after Kraft had increased its offer to an acceptable level. So the barriers we'd created, the strong defense, gave us really good foundations, and helping the directors see that all the way through the process so that they could make the right decision at the end of the day, absolutely key.
So you have you've been in interesting situations where you've learned a lot and seen a lot of directors and how they operate and what happens. So from your experience, if you could shed some light, let's say that a new director came up to you and said, what are the keys to me being an effective director? So from your perspective, sitting there arm's length watching all these boards, what would you offer them as sort of the keys that would help them be more effective?
The first key learning, I would say, is that you need to listen as much as you need to talk. Investor relations directors are very good communicators. We like to set out a very clear communication strategy, a very clear proposition for the company, and to communicate it externally. But when you join a company for the first time, or you get in that fortunate position where you can build a relationship of influence with those key stakeholders, the most important thing to do at the beginning is listen. Listen to what they want, listen to their concerns, and then find out how you can go about addressing those over the first 6, 12 months of your time as a director, serving and looking after that agenda which is so important to them today.
Do you participate in any kind of orientation program when a new director comes in?
I do. So I spend a good 2-3 hours with each of our new directors when they join, normally in the first couple of weeks of their coming on board the company, either through the ranks, so to speak, or as a non-executive director externally. So, we do a lot of work on inducting them to understand what our investors are concerned about. But often these days, we also use a wide range of our executive team in roadshow and investor relations activities. So they get an exposure to investors during the course of their jobs as they build their careers and get into the boardroom. And that's very valuable experience for them as well.
Yeah, still different though when you get on the other side of that boardroom.
Very different, absolutely. That door between the normal executive team and the boardroom is a big door. Governance becomes a very different issue to the one that they're used to when they're really just making sure they're not taking undue risks as an executive director. Once they're inside that boardroom, they have very different responsibilities, and it's a big agenda.
Well, the other thing is they're in an oversight mode where they're all their career they're used to solving problems, and really they're now in an oversight mode, and they can make suggestions, but it's really management's responsibility to solve those problems.
That's absolutely right. And for the transition for investor relations, one of the big positives of all of this, of course, is that as the profession has grown over the last 15, 20 years, more and more directors who are coming into the boardroom as non-execs with that perspective have experience of how really good investor relations is done. And as a result, they set very high expectations of what they want to see in the company they come into. And for smaller companies, bringing that experience into the boardroom, it's great for the company, it's great for IR.
So as a final question, I can't speak, I'm not knowledgeable enough to know the trends in the UK, but in the States, we're certainly seeing an amazing increase in shareholder activism. And as the money flows into hedge funds and the hedge funds are performing, that only makes more money flow in, and obviously shareholders are getting bolder and bolder. So the key is, for a lot of organizations, is how do you stay off somebody's radar? So you have a lot of experience in dealing with situations and proxy advisors and shareholder activists, whatever, sort of what are the keys to sort of staying off an activist radar?
Well, firstly, it's a trend which is on both sides of the pond. You know, we have a big activist agenda we have had for quite some time in the UK. The key really is about trying to make sure that you're addressing their needs before they become issues. If an activist is having to write to you and be public about that communication, it's because they feel they haven't been listened to. So that role, once again, as to how you help the board socialize and understand the issues that all investors have, not just the long-term ones, but the ones who are slightly more activist in nature. If they're coming to you as an IR team or directly to the company in another shape or form, you must make sure their voice is heard. You may resist it, you may take different decisions, but ultimately you need to find ways of addressing their concerns early on. And you know, if you can do that two-way before it becomes an issue, the activism tends to be much less effective.
I used to think that performance was like if you were a great performer that you'd automatically keep them away. But we've seen some very good companies like Apple, for example, because they had a big cash buildup, shareholders wanted that cash back to the shareholders. So that isn't even a good enough strategy at this point, but certainly it's important. That'll keep, if you're not undervalued, if you will, that should keep people away.
I think that's a very good point, TK. I mean, for companies that grow fast, evolve quickly, your investor proposition, what investors want from you, changes very quickly as well. And you get different mixes come into your register. So for the Apple, a company that had enormous success, fantastic revenues, lots of cash generation, they find themselves in that unfortunate position of being almost too successful, and they hadn't necessarily addressed some of the concerns that one or two investors have. Whether those investors are right or wrong, time will tell. But ultimately, knowing that's changing, having a good team helping you understand what they need, that's key.
John, I can't thank you enough for joining us, and this is some setting that we have here to do this, so we'll look forward to a great conference here. And that will conclude this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week where we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member, and we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.